is a theoretical paper called TRANSCINEMA, The Purpose, Uniqueness, and Future of Cinema. And basically, what's cool is that Marcel's work is praxis-based, and this will be like some sort of extension. There's also overlap with social media and technological stuff. So here, I basically coined this term, TRANSCINEMA, and I'll tell you exactly why. So before I move on, I'd like you to think of movies that have moved you deeply. I'd like you to keep these movies in your mind, maybe one movie, maybe a number of movies, or movies that you thought were thought-provoking. I have a still here from a movie that's like that for me. So you can have your own movie in your head as we're going through this. So, as a prefix, trans means beyond, but also through. So the question is beyond what exactly? And the idea is that I'm interested in a cinema that goes beyond entertainment and that goes beyond commercialism. And not that these are bad things, but the key point with the trans prefix is that you include that, but you go beyond that. And so the human being can be seen as an animal symbolicum who's trying to understand herself, to use Ernest Cassirer's term. And this means that we are like meaning-making beings. We're interested in meaning, and we use symbols, to capture those meanings, but also to understand ourselves and the world better. And so you can think of moving images in that sense as symbols. And so I also argue that transcinematic effects can be achieved through the exploration of transpersonal dimensions. And transpersonal is a term that comes from psychology, and it's a more technical term for spirituality. And it could mean between persons, it could mean through, and it could also mean beyond. It has all these meanings. So the question that made me interested in this is cinema dead. And this is a question that Peter Greenaway, the British filmmaker, thought about. And he thinks that in 1983, cinema died because of the invention of the remote control, the zapper. Once people were able to interact with the TV. So he's sort of like challenging this two-dimensional model of being inside a movie theater in the dark, watching a two-dimensional screen and just a story that has been decided by a filmmaker. He's kind of challenging that, and he's suggesting an alternative. And I see that parallels sort of Web 2.0 technologies and all the interactivity that can happen on the internet, which is kind of democratic if you think about it. So I'm not completely against the old school type of cinema, but also I'm imagining that cinema is going to change as affected by technology. And so he made this project called Looperpedia, which is described as the live cinema event of the Tulse Looper Suitcases project, an encyclopedic multimedia show deliberately made for the information age. And so basically what he did with that, he had like multiple screens, and he was almost like a VJ, which is like a DJ but using videos. And so he had a big screen that is a touch screen, and he was editing live as you're watching. And so he's interacting, and the plot is not predetermined, and it's happening, and it changes every time. So he's kind of challenging this old model of how we think about cinema. So in a way, it stretches the limit or even goes beyond it. And so the question is, if cinema is indeed dead, one is left with the spiritual question, is there an afterlife? And if so, what is it like? Perhaps the death of cinema is the rebirth of trans cinema. And so, in that sense, I try to resuscitate the Aristotelian notion of catharsis, going back more than 2,000 years ago. And catharsis, comes from Greek, and it means the purging of emotions through pity and fear. So, historically, dramatic structure, because cinema comes from theater, had a therapeutic healing purpose. So these are there's a lot of details to go through, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. But the three main areas of this paper are basically the transformative potential, which I argue is the forgotten purpose of cinema. We relate to movies, even mainstream movies, because of this. And whether you're making movies to make money or for artistic purposes, you have to think about this aspect that it's related to dramatic structure and catharsis, because that's the emotional connection that happens there between the film and the viewer. And then the second aspect is the transdisciplinarity, and this is a cool term. As you can see, I like all the trans terms. Playing with words a little bit. But basically, it's the idea that cinema includes these different disciplines, combines them, integrates them, and becomes its own thing. So like theater, architecture, painting, music, can all be part of cinema. And this is why I think it's unique, because it's such an inclusive medium. And then I think about its future vis-a-vis transhumanism, which ties in with your research, and this aspect of how technology is changing and accelerating, and how's that going to affect us, and where do they meet? So I'll try to be brief with these things. So the first one is the transformation. I talked about catharsis. So a lot of people think, we go to the movies, it's a form of escapism. We just go there to forget about worries and such. That's okay, but I think that's half of the story. The other half is the transformation of suffering. And I like the idea, the metaphor that the cinema screen is like a mirror, that we have to be careful because we don't want it to be a narcissistic exercise where we become delusional with our fantasies. So I'm interested more of like the cinema screen as a reflection of truths. It's not necessarily a positive thing. It could be ugly truths, it could be beautiful truths, or anything in between. But just some sort of mirror that will allow us to see something, and then we have to make a decision. How do we want to change ourselves or parts of ourselves? And that's a transformative aspect. And obviously this ties in with the work that we've done. So I build, of course, on a lot of research that has been done in those areas, and this is from Citizen Kane. Cinema as a cultural and or personal narrative, as well as this idea of cinema as cultural therapeutics. And this comes from Ramanujan's work. I like this word here. Vanderberg, this Dutch psychologist, came up with this word socioses, which is basically as an alternative to neurosis, but it's just for society. Maybe it's familiar with it. So everyone, did you all see The Matrix? Do you remember the red pill and the blue pill?
Sorry.
Which one is which? Do you remember?
I'm so sorry. This is...
No problem.
Your pressing scope.
It's my old phone.
So who remembers the red pill and the blue pill? Someone.
I don't remember what it was.
Well, the red pill basically was, if you take the red pill, you wake up from the Matrix, and then you experience reality. And then the blue pill is you forget about meeting Morpheus and you just remain in the Matrix. So I argue that trans cinema should be like the red pill. It shouldn't be like this have this sedating effect and let us live in illusion, but rather, wake us up from the virtual reality. Even though, if you in the Matrix, when Neo has the awakening, it's not necessarily again a very positive experience because the real world is pretty dark. The machines have destroyed the earth and they're ruling, and we don't want to go there. This is why we escape, but I think that that's actually more harmful. The more we escape, the better that we face the problem early on. We can do something about it, even if it's dark. Who likes 2001: A Space Odyssey? One of my favorites. So, of course, this is like a big mystery. What does this monolith mean, or what does it symbolize? And this is my favorite interpretation, that the monolith is a metaphor for the cinema screen, that is like angled differently. But it's basically a portal of your imagination. And you can project onto it anything you want. You can go there. So I like this idea of the cinema screen as a portal in general. So this is kind of like a portal within a portal. But again, you know, films that transport us to other dimensions so we can experience different emotions and ideas, and this all ties in with this transformative effect. I go more into details here about what catharsis means and all of these things, and how it's related to emotional health. That's the therapeutic aspect, because I study psychology, but I also have studied film, and I'm interested in how these two things, you know, tie in. And so Aristotle was basically skeptical of this idea of sentimentality, and I think this is the kind of thing that Hollywood films work on, instead of working on the emotional health part and the cathartic part. And I'm not saying all of them, but tends to be, I just want you to know that there's a difference there. And it's kind of like a subtle difference. But the sentimental part is, he considered that as more like an inferior art. It doesn't have that transformative effect. And of course, catharsis in Greek means purification. And this, you can know, if you're into esoteric stuff, this ties in with this alchemical transformation. You know, the transformation is not of base metals, but the transformation of the soul or the mind. So our own refinement. So it's like a metaphor. There's a filmmaker called Broughton who said that the secret name of cinema is transformation. I like that. And I talk about how surrealism specifically, but in general, avant-garde and experimental, and I think of experimental cinema, and I think of it like in comparison to experimental science, and I think of the avant-garde, which comes from, you know, it's like a military term, like the first people in line who usually, you know, get shots. And I like this sort of activist and political dimension as well as experimental scientific dimension. So obviously surrealism had a historical affinity with psychoanalysis. So this is a good place where psychology and film can meet. And I give examples of what I consider are trans films, but I mean, it's a big list. Right? Just go through some of them. This idea of cinema therapy is not a new idea. Not many people know about it. Most of you probably know about music therapy, art therapy. But there's also such a thing as cinema therapy, wherein the psychotherapist works with the client and they prescribe films that can help the client work with whatever issues they're going through, and the film sort of reflects some of these issues. So it could be a useful tool in a clinical context like that. But I'm also for like sort of a self-healing model as well. If you're not working with a psychotherapist, you can work with yourself. And I encourage actually people to make films even if they don't consider themselves filmmakers. Even if it's amateurish, I find it helpful to this is expressive. It's like you can think of it as a diary or journaling of some sort. Maybe more technically challenging, but still it could be very therapeutic, especially if you share it with people. So medicine and art are descended from the same roots. They both originated in magic, a practice based on the omnipotence of the word. And I like this notion because we always hear about the magic of cinema, right? I mean, it's not just a way of saying that. There's actually some overlap there. And then there's this Chilean filmmaker who came up with his own psychotherapeutic model called psychomagic. He's a filmmaker. This is a poster from an amazing film he made. And he said that the world is ill. We need to make therapy pictures. If art is not a medicine for the society, it is a poison. And I'm really convinced by that. So, I mean, it's kind of like an ethical question, spiritual question, psychological question. Try to go fast. So there's this movie called I Am a Sex Addict, which falls under this genre called confessional cinema. And the filmmaker, Kaveh Zahedi, it's a film about him. He was a sex addict. And he made a film about his sex addiction. And through the film, he eventually recovers. But it's a really painful process.